There is a level of productivity that makes others look at you with discomfort, even fear, not because you work more than they do, nor because you sacrifice your life or become obsessed with work, but because you never procrastinate, never complain, never need motivation to start, while the people around you stay busy all day, in endless meetings with dozens of tabs open, and end the evening feeling exhausted. You consistently produce something concrete, tangible, something you can point to and say, this is what I completed today. What unsettles them is not the result itself, but the calm way you produce it, because you don't look like someone who's trying hard. And then a dangerous question arises. If you're not lazy, if you truly want to move forward, then why does their entire day disappear without leaving any trace? The uncomfortable truth is that laziness is rarely a matter of willpower. It is the consequence of an unstructured day, without startup rituals, without a point where action must happen regardless of emotion. While the West obsesses over optimizing productivity, finding better tools and stronger motivation, the Japanese, for centuries, chose a different path. They don't optimize productivity, they ritualize it, turning action into something that happens at fixed times and in fixed sequences. And it must be said right from the start, this ancient system does not make you feel better about yourself. It exists to coldly and non-negotiably kill the procrastinator inside you. Chapter 1. The Awakening. The story I'm about to tell happened to a man named Ethan Walker, 34 years old, working in tech in America, the kind of job that from the outside looks like he's doing fine. Good salary, clear position, packed meeting schedule, projects that sound important, and a future that appears reasonably safe. Ethan is not unemployed, not useless, not lacking in ability. In fact, he's the person colleagues often turn to for opinions or solutions. But there is a silent paradox that quietly erodes him every day. Ethan is always busy but never gets anywhere. Every morning he opens his laptop with a determined plan, telling himself today he will focus, today he will push the project forward, today he will not let time slip away meaninglessly. But just a few hours later, meetings start crowding in, emails and messages arrive non-stop. Quick, check this for me. Requests stretch into the whole morning. And before Ethan can touch the most important task, his day has already been fragmented into tiny pieces. By noon he has said a lot, responded a lot, switched between tabs a lot. But if asked, what did you actually complete this morning, he would only have vague phrases like working on it, waiting on, aligning, words that make everything sound like progress, when in reality it isn't. The afternoon is when procrastination shows itself most clearly. Energy drops, and instead of facing the hard part, Ethan starts doing small, trivial tasks to reassure himself he's still working. Tweaking unnecessary details, rereading documents he's already read, replying to non-urgent emails, and telling himself he's preparing for the bigger thing. By evening, when the laptop closes, the familiar feeling returns, a tiredness mixed with frustration, because he was busy all day but has nothing concrete to point to as the result of that day. And like every other night, he promises himself tomorrow will be different. Tomorrow he will focus more. Tomorrow he won't let everything slip away again. Ethan has tried almost everything the modern world tells someone like him to try. Productivity apps, life-changing time-blocking methods, countless motivational videos claiming that with enough determination, everything will be fine. But each tool only gives him a fleeting sense of control for a few days before the old loop returns. The scariest thing is not that Ethan doesn't work, it's that he works a tremendous amount and still doesn't move forward. The turning point came during what seemed like a routine performance review, when his manager said one short but painfully accurate sentence, that Ethan has potential but output is inconsistent, while a less flashy colleague had just been given a higher role because they always delivered results on time. On the drive home that day, Ethan could neither argue back nor comfort himself like before, because a question began to form clearly in his mind. Am I lazy? Or have I been running my life in a fundamentally wrong way that I'm only now brave enough to face directly? Chapter 2. The Japanese Productivity Ritual. Ethan didn't actively go looking for a new philosophy. He was too exhausted from constantly hunting for solutions to his life. And that's exactly why the thing that changed his trajectory came by accident. During an internal company sharing session, An external consultant spoke about how Japanese organizations maintain stable performance for decades, and amid familiar concepts about strategy and process, he dropped a sentence that stopped Ethan cold. The Japanese don't optimize productivity, they ritualize it. The statement sounded strange, almost counterintuitive to everything Ethan had ever believed, and that's precisely why it stuck with him. After the talk, Ethan stayed behind, read more materials, and for the first time encountered what is called the Japanese productivity ritual, not as a work method, but as a life operating system. The roots of this system do not lie in the modern world but originate from Japanese Zen monasteries, where for hundreds of years people have performed identical actions every day without needing motivation, inspiration, or ever wondering whether they should do it today. There exists a principle called gyoji, or gyuji, meaning continuous practice without gaps. A simple but ruthless concept because it allows no exceptions, no empty spaces, no negotiation with emotion. Ethan read about the bells that ring at exact times every day in the monastery, about monks who never lie in bed wondering whether they will meditate today, because that question simply does not exist in their system. And from here, the difference between how the West and Japan view productivity becomes strikingly clear. In the West, productivity is something to be optimized, flexible, adjusted to mood and energy. You're encouraged to change methods when bored, seek motivation when tired, and unwittingly, every day you must make dozens of decisions just to begin. In contrast, in Japanese thinking, action does not need to align with emotion. Emotion must submit to the ritual. Everything is standardized to the point where there is no room for debate. This task happens at this time in this way, regardless of how you feel. As he read deeper, Ethan realized a core principle that chilled him. The human brain quietly classifies every task into two groups: things that can be skipped and things that cannot be skipped. Tasks in the can be skipped group always invite negotiation: today or tomorrow, now or later, do less or do more, and it is these negotiations that drain energy, not the work itself. In contrast, tasks in the cannot be skipped group simply happen, like brushing your teeth or buckling your seatbelt. You don't need motivation to do them. You do them because that's how the day is structured. And in that moment, Ethan understood that high productivity does not come from trying harder or being more disciplined. It comes from removing action from the list of choices, turning it into something mandatory. Laziness, in this view, is not a bad habit or moral failing. It is the consequence of days without rituals, of gaps where the brain is allowed to ask, should I do it? And when that gap exists, procrastination always wins. Ethan sat with that thought for a very long time, because it explained his life for years with perfect accuracy, not because he was lazy, but because every important action had been placed in the skippable zone, and in that quiet realization, he saw a simple but terrifying sentence: laziness is not a habit, it is the space between rituals. Chapter 3. The War Against Procrastination. After realizing the problem was not in his willpower but in how his day was structured, Ethan stopped searching for more inspiration or motivation. He began doing the one thing the Japanese mindset demands: placing a ritual in the right spot. He chose a fixed time slot early in the morning, not because he loved sunrises or enjoyed waking up early, but because it was the only time of day when the world was still quiet. No messages, no emails, no one needing an immediate reply. This was not an optimization decision, it was an elimination decision, eliminating every factor that could become an excuse to procrastinate. Ethan didn't call it work time. He called it the non-negotiable output block, a period whose sole purpose was to produce something complete, even if small, even if imperfect, but something that could be finished. Once that time slot was set, he began cutting away the things that had been eating his days. Notifications completely off, email blocked, phone left in another room, not as some noble act of discipline, but as a way to seal the door so the brain had no escape route. The first week went exactly as Ethan predicted, and worse than he imagined. Every morning waking up felt heavy. The body resisted, the mind sluggish, and the brain kept whispering that this was unnecessary, that he could do it later, that one day wouldn't make a difference. With no familiar distractions to cling to, the discomfort stood naked, and for the first time in years, Ethan had to sit still in front of the screen with his own procrastination and nothing to hide it behind. Strangely, after a few days, a small but crucial change began to appear. His brain stopped arguing about when. The time slot was fixed, no gaps for bargaining, no alternative options, and so the familiar later question disappeared. But as one door closed, another opened. Instead of arguing about timing, Ethan's mind started negotiating about content. Should he work on this or that this morning? Should he start with idea A or idea B? Should he write, edit, or do a bit more research to be sure? These debates were subtler, more reasonable, and more dangerous because they wore the appearance of professionalism and care. Ethan realized that even though the time slot was fixed, his productivity was still leaking through small decisions, through constantly changing tasks, through endlessly adjusting the approach under the excuse of finding a better way. Some mornings he finished the block feeling he had worked seriously, but when he looked back, all he had were scattered fragments, beginnings that were never pushed to completion. Procrastination didn't disappear, it only changed shape from avoiding time to avoiding commitment. This left Ethan confused and even disappointed, because he had done exactly what he learned: woken up on time, eliminated distractions, sat down to work, yet the results were still inconsistent. And it was in that confusion that an uncomfortable truth slowly emerged. The brain doesn't need many choices to sabotage productivity. Just one crack is enough. When allowed to change tasks, change methods, change completion criteria, it always finds a way to pull action back into the safe zone, where there is no risk of finishing, no pressure of ending. Ethan began to see that he had only solved half the problem. He had eliminated the question of when, but he had left open the questions of what and how, and it was precisely those questions that were quietly sustaining procrastination under a more sophisticated disguise. Every morning the battle was no longer between him and the bed. It was between him and a series of seemingly reasonable choices, and in that battle, real productivity had not yet gained the upper hand. This was the moment Ethan understood that the Japanese ritual does not only demand a fixed time slot, it demands something far more ruthless, and if he did not accept this next step, all his efforts so far would simply be a more sophisticated loop of the same old problem. Chapter 4. The One-Way Path. When Ethan realized that his procrastination no longer came from failing to sit down at his desk, but from always having too many choices within the already fixed time block, he was forced to confront a Japanese principle that felt uncomfortable from the very first time he heard it. Variety is where productivity dies. This principle runs completely counter to Western intuition, where people believe change keeps things interesting, flexibility prevents burnout, and choice is the expression of freedom. But Ethan began to see clearly a truth he had never dared admit before. It was precisely those small choices that drained his energy bit by bit. And so he did what he would previously have called extreme. Ethan locked everything down within his output creation block. Not just the time, but also the content inside it. One single type of output, one single sequence, one single duration, every day exactly the same. No more today write, tomorrow edit. No more review to make sure. No more switch tasks to avoid boredom. Only one fixed chain of actions repeated every morning like a ritual. He set himself a specific time period. Not too long, not too short. Just enough to feel uncomfortable, but not enough to negotiate. And committed to 90 days without changing anything. Not for emotion, not for inspiration, not for any seemingly reasonable reason. Reactions from those around him came quickly. Some said he was being too extreme, that working like that wasn't sustainable, that humans aren't machines. Others were gentler, saying he needed balance, that life shouldn't be locked down like that. Ethan listened to all of it, but he didn't argue, because for the first time in years he could feel something new forming beneath the discomfort. Silence in his mind. The third week arrived with a fierce rebellion from his mind. No longer gentle whispers but clear thoughts that this was stupid, that he was unnecessarily imprisoning himself in a rigid framework, that just changing a little wouldn't hurt. But unlike before, Ethan didn't need to answer those thoughts, because the schedule answered for him. Same time, same task, same order. His body began moving before his consciousness could object. By the fourth and fifth weeks, a strange phenomenon occurred. Procrastination didn't disappear completely, but it weakened like a noise fading into the distance, and action began to happen faster than thought. Ethan realized there were mornings when he was already halfway through the block before he noticed he had started. It was during this phase that disruptions appeared, as if life wanted to test whether his ritual could truly hold. He got sick, not severely, but enough to make him feel exhausted, that in the past he would have used as an excuse to skip. There were unexpected business trips that broke his routine, cramped hotel rooms, chaotic schedules. There were days when work demands completely shattered the plan due to urgent company requests. In the past, these would have been breaking points where all his efforts collapsed, where he would tell himself, just skip today, tomorrow, I'll do it properly, and one skip day would be enough to bring the whole chain down. But this time something different happened. Ethan no longer had the concept of a skip day. When things weren't favorable, he didn't abandon the ritual, he only shrank it. A minimal version appeared, shorter, lighter, imperfect, but still the same chain of actions, the same order, the same meaning. The block still existed. He produced output in hotel rooms, in the fragmented gaps of business trip days, even when exhausted, and each time it became clearer than ever, what mattered was not doing it well, but not creating any gaps. For the first time in his life, Ethan experienced a form of productivity that didn't need to be pushed, didn't need to be urged, didn't need to be protected by motivation, because it sustained itself. Not because he became stronger, but because he had eliminated almost every point where procrastination could attach itself. And in that seemingly monotonous repetition, Ethan began to understand why the Japanese call this a one-way path. Once you go deep enough into it, returning to the old state is no longer easy. Not because you're not allowed, but because your body and mind have learned a new way of operating, where productivity is no longer something to pursue, but something that happens automatically every day. Chapter 5. The Transformation. On the 90th day, there was no moment of celebration, no grand sense of victory, and no point where Ethan sat back and told himself he had succeeded, because what had changed was no longer in his emotions but in his default state. Ethan no longer tried to work. He didn't need to push himself to start, didn't need to convince himself to sit down, didn't need motivation to overcome laziness, because every morning, at the same familiar time slot, his body automatically entered the programmed chain of actions, and output appeared like a reflex, steady, quiet, undramatic. There were days when Ethan only realized he had completed the work when he closed the session and looked at what had just been created, because the process no longer required constant involvement of willpower. And it was precisely this normalcy that began to catch the attention of those around him. Ethan's colleagues noticed he no longer complained about workload, no longer talked about being overwhelmed or lacking time, while the results he delivered grew increasingly consistent. Some started comparing, asking what tools or methods he used. Some half-jokingly said he was overdoing it, that there was no need to live like that, and some said outright that the way he worked made them uncomfortable, because it exposed something they always tried to avoid, that the problem wasn't about time or circumstances. One afternoon, after Ethan sent a deliverable on time without appearing stressed or rushed, a colleague looked at him and said, almost blurted out, that his consistency was genuinely scary. Ethan just nodded, because he understood exactly where that feeling came from. In the quiet days that followed, when he no longer had to fight procrastination every morning, Ethan began to look back on his entire journey with a cold clarity. He realized he had never truly defeated laziness. He didn't conquer it with willpower, nor did he force himself to become more diligent. What he did was simply erase the environment that laziness needed to survive. When there were no more gaps for negotiation, no more choices for procrastination, no more question of should I do it, laziness had nowhere to stand. It didn't disappear because it was destroyed. It disappeared because there was nowhere left to hide. And from that perspective, the entire Japanese productivity ritual revealed itself as a closed system, emotionless, uninspiring, but extremely effective. It all begins with a public ritual where commitment is no longer a private thought, but a statement with weight. Then comes a fixed time slot, inflexible, non-negotiable, where action happens regardless of emotion. Next is a single type of output, repeated in the same sequence, to eliminate every gap for hesitation. No gaps means no skipped days, only the full version or the minimal version, but the ritual always exists. And finally, preset responses for every disruption. So when life breaks the plan, the brain doesn't have to decide in chaos, it simply executes what has already been written. When all these elements combine, productivity is no longer something to be chased, it becomes the natural consequence of a differently designed day. Ethan understood that what made others uncomfortable wasn't that he did more, but that he no longer struggled with problems they considered inevitable. His existence became living proof that procrastination is not human nature, but the product of a loose system. And when that system is replaced, the person changes too. This is when the final question emerges, not directed at Ethan anymore, but straight at whoever is listening to this story. Laziness doesn't disappear when you fight it. It disappears when there is nowhere left to hide. Are you ready to become the person who makes procrastination unable to survive around them? If this story has made you see productivity and procrastination differently, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next content for those who refuse to live busy without moving forward. Thank you for following this far, and see you in the next video.